such a time as this.
And welcome to For Such a Time as This, a round table, first one in 2023, January 11th. We have with us a special guest, Tom. I'm going to let Vicki introduce him. Vicki is going to actually do, quote unquote, an interview with Tom, our special guest. But before we get to him, I would ask that you go to forsuchatimesthis.today, forsuchatimesthis.today, not .com, not .org, .today, forsuchatimesthis.today. There, you could always see our newest material as the liberal platforms continue to squeeze us out. You can always see us there at our website, forsuchatimesthis.today. Okay, we'll begin. Vicki, take it away.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Happy New Year. And we have a great one for you tonight. We have a very special guest. His name is Tom Hampson. And Tom and I met a number of years ago. We've been in touch for a number of years regarding what's been going on in our local schools. And I thought it would be really special to bring him on so you could all hear from him as well. Tom is a subject matter expert in childhood sexual exploitation, an international investigator, and the founder of a foundation called the Truth Alliance Foundation. Tom has led a really fascinating career, spanning, all over the world, fighting organized crime, as well as, the focus on a lot of his work has been protecting children, and which led to the founding of his foundation that we will also talk about. And there's just a lot to cover, so we're going to get right into it. First, we're going to, just also to let you know, Tom did just recently attend a national conference. It's called the National Sex Ed Conference, right, Tom?
Right.
And Pastor James and I have been really curious to hear about that conference, but rather than just talk to Tom privately, we thought we would share it all with our great listeners so you can find out what went on at that conference also. So that's going to be a little bit later. First, we're just going to lay the groundwork and Tom's going to tell you more about who he is and what he's been doing since really the 1970s, Tom. You've been working to protect children.
Right. Well, I actually started in the 60s. I was in the Air Force. I was in Air Force intelligence during the Vietnam War. And then after I got out of that, I went to work for an agency here in Illinois. It was more commonly known as the Illinois Crime Investigating Commission, but the official title became the Illinois Legislative Investigating Commission. And we're a unique agency, had powers very similar to a grand jury. We could compel witness testimony, petition for grants of immunity. We had a full staff of investigators that we did a variety of investigations. Our primary purpose was to investigate organized crime and official misconduct. And it was during that, it was because of that specialty that we were asked to investigate this new problem that was seen as a new problem of the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Young girls were starting to show up on the streets of big cities and being noticed by police and other agencies, like whether it was Chicago, New York, Minneapolis, all of the big cities. And they were adolescents, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. There was a national focus on this, and news media looked at this, and they were talking about how this was organized crime inspired. And so because of our focus of organized crime in Illinois, we were asked to do the investigation. So that started an 8-year investigation into the sexual exploitation of children that we developed considerable expertise in it. In fact, we helped draft the first child pornography statute in Illinois. We developed the investigative technique that's now used all over the world to operate a sting on child predators. Back in those days, we had to, our stings had to be operated through advertisements in porno magazines.
Oh, my.
It wasn't on the internet.
There was no internet.
There was
back
no
then.
internet back then, so it was all advertising in the
Back of the
porno magazines, and
wow.
we would solicit child pornography. We would solicit kids and then get responses. It was all by mail. So we worked closely with the postal inspectors. And so we developed that method, and then when the internet came along, it started being adapted to internet use, and so they're still doing it now. Even private citizens are doing it. Catch a predator kind of thing.
Yes, I think everybody's familiar with that.
So, well, that was one of our investigative techniques, and the good thing about that was that it prevented children from being required to testify. There's a lot of problems with child testimony. It's a he said, she said kind of thing. Children are really not very good witnesses
and
because
it's so
of
traumatic for
right,
them.
very traumatic. They're
You're re-traumatizing.
Exactly, and so because of that, we also developed the initial enabling legislation that was used in enabling legislation for the child advocacy centers.
What's enabling legislation?
That was the first legislation that started the first child advocacy centers.
Okay. Got it.
It later became known as child advocacy centers. It wasn't back then. It was called, we focused on it as being like a multidisciplinary team. But then later revisions, it became the child advocacy centers. And the purpose of that was that when a child was either sexually or physically abused or a witness of any crime, the advocacy center would interview the witness, eliminating the need for the child to be interviewed multiple times by the police officers, by the prosecutors. They would just interview them, videotape it, and everybody could use it. And then the advocacy centers also developed a relationship with the kids that if they had to re-interview them, they could. And it wasn't just the kids they developed a relationship with; it was the whole family, the parents, and everybody, because it helped protect the child from trauma. So that was we developed that.
There was a lot that came out of your investigation.
Oh, yeah,
that
there are
set
many.
the stage.
Well, in our method, what we did was introduced to agencies all over the United States. There was a deputy sheriff in the Cook County Sheriff's Department that actually went out and gave presentations to sheriffs all over the country, and sheriff's office in multiple states picked it up. And then local police departments, state police, everybody started. So now our method went all over the United States, and then it went all over the world.
Wow!
And so, in those days, I thought that that would be the end of it. That if we locked enough of these people up, the problem would begin to diminish.
Right.
And so we moved on to other investigations. I've done many different kinds of investigations. Our focus was always more on organized crime than anything else. When I left the state, I started my own investigative agency, and we did work for corporations mostly all over the world, specializing in what's known as due diligence investigations. And I think we did investigations in over 100 countries around the world. And then in 2004, I shut down that business, and I just did investigations on my own.
Okay.
And a couple of years after that, I was asked by the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services to investigate the predator priests in Illinois. That was shortly after it was a 2004 expose on the Catholic Church, on the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church by the priests. And the DCFS at the time didn't have people available who had expertise in this area and criminal investigations, and so the chief counsel there asked me to come in and do these investigations. So I did that for about a year and a half. Investigated all the past cases that were known and also several significant cases. And it was during that investigation that I realized the solutions we came up with in the 70s and early 80s to protect kids from sexual predators weren't working the way we'd hoped.
And why was that?
Well, it turns out that there were a lot more predators than we expected.
Yeah.
And the ones that got caught were not being kept in jail as long as they should have been. And so one of the things that I tell people now is to give you an idea of what the scope of the problem is. Several years ago, there was a online network of predators called boylover.net that was discovered by investigators in the Netherlands, and they provided leads to police agencies all over the world, UK, Switzerland, the United States, Australia, all over the world. They had these leads. In the United States, there were several people that were identified as involved in it. But to date, totally in the world, only 184 predators have been prosecuted. And yet that network had 70,000 members. And there are thousands of networks just like it.
Yeah.
Why is that, Tom?
Well, it takes a long time to investigate and develop a criminal case, because it's not like it is in the movies where you got an hour and you've solved the case and you lock somebody up. These are very tedious cases to work. When you've got the crimes being committed online, you have to prove that it was that person that downloaded the image or asked for the image or whatever. You can't see them, so it's all electronic stuff. And it's very labor intensive, and there just aren't enough investigators. So what I realized was that the law enforcement was not equipped to deal with this problem alone.
They just couldn't keep up with it.
And the only way that we can do this is to try to equip the general citizenry to protect children, to keep children away from predators. And so that's why I started the Truth Alliance Foundation, was to come up with a better way to deal with this problem. And the focus that I made was that prevention was the better course than trying to lock them all up.
Right.
I mean, I'd like to lock them all up,
Sure.
but it's just not a realistic thing.
Like cockroaches, there's just too many of them.
Too many of them. And so...
So you got to identify who they are, and then also...
Right. And this thing with the priests, it was really an epiphany for me when I realized how serious this problem was, because within the Catholic Church and also
other churches
within
too.
other churches too, it's every church. These people were not only destroying these kids emotionally,
right,
but many of them, they were destroying these kids and entire families spiritually.
Correct.
People were falling away from the church as a result of it.
They're destroying their relationship with God.
Right. And so, well, I heard the stories of it. They said, well, what kind of God would allow this kind of thing? There must not be one. And so that's how I thought, well, it's a pretty serious problem in the church, and if we can educate the people in the church on how to recognize these predators and how to keep them away from kids, then those people can take that out into the general community, because the majority of people are Christians in this country. I mean, not all of them go to church, But
they're professing
right,
Christians.
they're professing Christians. But so if we can get them, if we can get them to learn how to see the predator and how to protect their children in the right way, then sooner or later, these people aren't going to have anybody they can go after anymore. And
Right.
so,
Right.
and then that would make them more desperate and makes them more vulnerable to being picked up by the police when they do something really stupid. Because right now they're very slick. The fact is that less than 2% of these child sexual predators are ever caught.
Oh my gosh.
98% of them
devastating.
get away scot-free. So when you do a background investigation on them, 98% of them are gonna come up clean.
Wow. Right. So it doesn't do any
Right,
good.
it doesn't do any good. Background
because they're either pre-being caught or they're never going to be caught.
Right. So you have to learn how to recognize them using indicators that aren't criminal. You have to recognize character patterns, behavior patterns.
Like, give us one example.
Well, one example, the one that even the most skilled psychopath has a very difficult time masking is the tendency to blame other people when things go wrong.
Yeah.
They just can't help themselves. It's like just any narcissist, because a psychopath is basically a narcissist plus. They will say things like, "Well, yeah, I take responsibility because I'm the boss, so it's my fault. Really, buck stops with me. But I shouldn't have hired that idiot." And it says, I can't know everything, and I had to trust people, and
Right.
and it's really their fault, basically. So they'll even when they cannot help it when they do that, they can't take
They
responsibility.
don't even, because they don't even see it.
No, they don't see it because
they have no ability to, no self-awareness on it.
right. And so that's the thing that is probably the universal. So if you're hanging around somebody that just can't take responsibility
It's a red
when
flag.
something goes wrong, then you just get away from them.
It's a red flag.
But you know
Because
what?
even if they're not child predators, they're probably some kind of predator.
But you have to be that screwed up in order to hurt children. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
just completely unaware of self doing any wrong. I mean, you've got to be in that mindset to hurt children.
Well, the idea that these people can be cured is ridiculous. I mean, they have all these psychologists out there. Well, they've been cured. They haven't there's been no recidivism in 5 years. Well, you never catch them anyway. So how do you know?
How would you know?
And so it's absurd that they're in 1947. This guy, Father Gerald Fitzgerald, started the Servants of the Paracletes in the Catholic Church, and his purpose was to develop a program to help restore priests to the priesthood that had been like they became depressed because of all the terrible stories they hear. They have an alcohol problem, or maybe they've got some other kind of issue that if it's not corrected, they're going to leave the priesthood, or they won't be any good as priests. So he wanted to rehabilitate these priests. Mm-hmm. So he started this, and shortly afterwards, one of the bishops came to him and says, "Well, can you help these people who are have fallen because of some sex issue? They've had an affair with some woman, or maybe they're with a guy or whatever." And he says, "Yeah, sure, I'll try it with them." And then somebody came to him and said, "Well, we're having some of these priests that are having relationships with kids. Can you try them out?" And he says, "Well, yeah, I guess I can do that." This is like probably 1948 or 49. So he's trying to work with. Now everybody else is working just fine. He's doing this really well. But I guess it was in 1952. There was a letter that he wrote, and he says, "I'm not sure these people, we can do much for them. I think what they need is to be put on an island somewhere."
Talking about the ones that mess with kids.
Yeah, the ones that are going after kids, and put them on an island somewhere and have them just meditate for the rest. Just keep them away from everybody because we can't seem to rehabilitate them.
Yeah, that's reprobate mind. I think in Romans 1, they're gone.
And so then, and so then, there's a letter in 1957 that because they kept sending them to him. There's a letter in 1957 that he wrote, and he says, "There is no hope for these people. They are devils."
Wow.
They are devils. Yeah. And he has a scheduled appointment with the Holy Father in Rome. And he's going to bring this up to him. He says, these people need to be removed from the priesthood immediately. Yeah. And so even this guy who had a heart for trying to help them, after 8 years, he just totally said, no, these people are not help. You can't help them. They are devils.
Wow.
And so, and that's the truth. And that's what the problem is in our culture today, is that we have this idea that you can fix everybody,
right.
But there's some people that just aren't fixable, and these child sexual predators are not fixable.
And you have to want to be fixed,
right.
too.
Well, now I won't say all of them are. There's 4 kinds of child predators. You have the ones that are mentally ill. And so those can be helped. I mean, they might, because of some mental illness or whatever, that they wind up sexually abusing a child, schizophrenic or somebody like that. If you can solve that other mental illness problem, then you can rehabilitate them. And then there's also people that are doing it for experimental purposes. Usually this applies to younger kids. Younger kids will try things out
that's
that
different.
they learn.
Yeah, I would take a younger kid's different than
and so these are maybe young kids or adolescents or whatever, and they are dabbling in it, and those probably can be helped. But there's an increasing number of child predators that are already lost. And then you have the sociopath, who is more they don't necessarily go after kids in particular, but they don't have any qualms about sexually abusing them. But these child sexual predators, these preferential child sexual predators, they're the ones that I'm talking about. They're the ones that are the psychopaths. They have absolutely no interest in any kind of help. They pretend that they do, maybe, if they get caught, but they're responsible for 95% of the cases of child sexual abuse.
Wow.
On average, they will abuse 150 kids during their lifetime.
Oh, my God.
And these people need to be locked up. And if you can't lock them up, you need to keep them as far away from kids as possible. The problem is that these people also gravitate to jobs and to volunteer positions that put them in contact with other kids, with kids. Of
course.
It's just like any predator; they go where the prey is.
Right.
Of course.
Right.
If you want to, no matter what it is, if you want to get if you're a deer hunter or something, you want to get the deer, go to the watering hole.
Correct.
Right.
And so that's where you get them, and that's what these people do too. So where is that? That's in churches and schools and sports clubs and other kinds of places where they gravitate. Yeah. So anyway, that's because of that. That's why I started the Truth Alliance Foundation, to try to come up with a better way to protect children, because we're not going to do it solely relying on law enforcement. And the biggest problem has been people in our culture today are more focused on specializing, and they have this idea that it's somebody else's responsibility. It's the police's responsibility to do it. It's the school's responsibility. And really, I can't, because I'm too busy doing my own work. And and so that's the thing you have to overcome, is to get people to realize that there are certain things that we need to become involved in on a routine basis.
Right. So if you want to learn more about the foundation, it's truthalliancefoundation.org. So one of the things we've been doing here at New Hope are these mind polluter events. and showing that documentary or portions of it. And you actually know a lot of the key people that are in that documentary.
I do, yeah. Yeah, in fact, one of the key people was a very good friend of mine, Judith Reisman. She died about a year and a half ago. And I worked with her for
She was
about
the one
10
on
years.
Donahue in the documentary, right?
Yes.
Yep. Show the table 34,
Right.
Phil.
The charts. Yeah.
I loved her. She was just terrific. She was the most dedicated person for years, and she worked against the whole Kinsey fraud alone practically for a couple of decades.
Yeah, I read your blog post about her on your website last night. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, she was terrific.
So yeah, that brings us, because we've been talking about these national sex education standards that were developed by these radical groups, including Advocates for Youth and SIECUS, and Illinois became the first state to adopt them in 2021, and saying that schools needed to start teaching these. However, an opt-out, thankfully, was included in the legislation. That's supposedly the only way it got passed. And of course, just on a side note, during the lame duck session, a few days ago, they tried to get legislation. They did a gut and replace on a bill in Springfield to get rid of the opt-out, to force every school in Illinois to teach the national sex ed standards. Thankfully, it did not pass the lame duck session, but knowing our what's the word I want to use, extremists in Springfield, they will likely try to bring that back.
They are tenacious.
Currently, the opt-out still exists, and the majority of school districts, 549, I believe at last count, out of 861, have used that opt-out. So, yeah, these standards are egregious. We've talked about that before on the round table. And you actually went to a conference a few weeks ago, a national conference, with the authors of these egregious standards.
Right. Yeah. The people, the architects of these national sex ed standards basically are people associated with the National Sex Ed Center out in New Jersey, and they're all affiliated with Planned Parenthood, Advocates for Youth, and SIECUS. Those are the core groups. But then there's all these other people that are affiliated with them. They all gravitate around this. They previously were called the sex positive. The sex positive movement is what they were.
What does that mean, sex positive?
Well, because it's just like pro-choice, you know.
Everything about
they
sex
spin
is
everything.
great.
Oh,
yeah, it's all
about sex is positive.
Yeah, it's all.
Children are sexual from birth.
Right, children are sexual from birth. That they International Planned Parenthood several years ago drafted the International Sexual Rights of the Child that asserts that every child has a right to experience sexual pleasure from birth. And so they can decide with whom, when, and with whom they want to have sex, and nobody should have any say in it whatsoever.
We went to an event yesterday, just recently, and we actually talked about this, and there was two gentlemen who were clearly on the left side. And one of the things I asked them at one point, do you believe children are sexual from birth? You realize they wouldn't answer that question.
Right.
They wouldn't answer it.
Well, no, because because the average person realizes this is that it exposes them as being
that's my question.
Predatory.
Pervert.
That's my question.
Perverts, yeah.
Yep.
And but these people with the National Sex Ed Center and the people that go to the National Sex Ed Conference, many of them are associated with Division 44, the American Psychological Association, which is the LGBT-focused subcommittee of the American Psychological Association. They're the ones that generate the so-called science behind these sex ed standards. And but you have to realize that there is no science to this.
No.
It is all made up. It's a complete fantasy. It's a fiction. I went to the same conference 7 years ago, and that was when they first started using pronouns. In fact, they had a little button that they passed out to everybody that said pronouns on it. And I didn't know what they were talking about, or I didn't know what this button meant. And I asked somebody else at the table, and I says, "What do they mean about pronouns?" He says, "Well, what pronouns do you use?" I says, "What does that mean?" So I was completely ignorant.
Help me out again. The conference you went to is for whom now again?
It's for people who are sex educators.
Oh my!
And a lot of them, most of the material is done by Planned Parenthood. That's where they make a lot of money doing that.
Oh my!
It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. This whole sex ed publication business.
Yeah.
But back then, in 7 years ago, that was focused almost totally on sex. A lot of it was same-sex relationships, lesbian, gay kind of stuff. But at that conference, it was 2015. That was the first time that they also introduced the idea that they were affiliating with Black Lives Matters. There was a standard that was started where they said sex educators for stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matters in
2015. I didn't even know Black Lives Matter was around.
Right. Oh yeah, Black Lives Matters. They started after the guy down in Florida that got shot.
Yeah, I know. Trayvon
Martin. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They started after that. That's when they first started. They stood in solidarity for racial justice. Well, in the intervening 7 years, that has metastasized into which was evident at this last conference, into an agglomeration of every little victim group that's out there. They have the LGBTs. They started the conference by saying just wanted to acknowledge that the conference is being held on land that had been stolen from the Lenape Indians. And so they were talking about, so it was like all this BIPOC, the black, indigenous, and people of color. And so all of it was focused on that. A lot of it was focused on the gender inequity. The people introduced themselves by a variety of identities that they can. I guess you win points for the number of different identities you have, and the one woman gave a talk, was identified herself as queer, disabled, fat femme, because well, one of the things is that if and I'm overweight myself, so I thought I kind of like this. It says they're pursuing what was it?
Fat positivity, fat acceptance.
No, fat liberation and fat justice.
Fat justice.
Yeah, fat liberation and fat justice. So everybody, so now, even though I'm a straight white man, which is the pinnacle of,
you get negative
points. I'm the pinnacle of the oppressor.
Yeah.
I now have 1 point for being a victim. And so, but that's what these focus are, and the standards themselves have been set up to promote not only these bizarre gender ideas, but also to promote all these different overcoming all the different oppression categories that people fall into.
Yeah.
And so, and actually, the revised National Sex Ed standards include all those things in it, and all of those standards are going to be part of what's the big thing now is the social emotional learning. So, one of the things you have to realize too is that this is not new. In the early 1900s, when sex ed first started to be developed, it was it was introduced in schools in secret, and in many places. There was an experiment that was done in Chicago. There was a failure because the general public couldn't stand it. They said they don't want any part of it. So then it went away in Chicago, and then a whole bunch of school districts started implementing it in secret, but they distributed it among different classes. So they presented it in family life classes and.
Let me ask.
Yeah.
Who or what organization was doing this back in the early 1900s?
Well, it started. National Education Association was one of the main publishers. Was the main promoters of it. The NEA started in 1857, so it's been around for a long time.
Okay.
And they're still the ones that are primarily behind a lot of these weirdness things that are going on in the schools.
NEA.
National Education Association. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, they're recently Abigail Schreier, last year was in a podcast with Megan Kelly, and she talked about receiving a tape from somebody that attended a NEA conference, or not, it wasn't an NEA, it was a California Teachers Union conference, which is kind of, it was a little bit different, but the teachers at this conference were promoting the idea that they needed to teach about transgender, help kids in the transgender issue in secret from the parents, to keep it how to keep things secret from the parents. Right. And that's happening all over the country. This is becoming a common kind of thing, and even. I mean, look at what happened with sex ed here in the United States. It got exposed by parents watching the Zoom classes during the lockdown, and parents were like utterly shocked.
Yep.
In our area, all over the country, a few years ago, I don't know if you remember it. In this area right here, there was the discovery that all of a sudden they had some kids in transgender kids in the opposite locker room.
Oh yeah, yep.
Okay, so
Yep.
that's actually how we
that.
first met over that issue.
Yeah.
Yep, that's where we first.
That became public 5 years after the schools were working on it in this area, and the school districts, the school boards, kept it completely secret from all the parents. Nobody knew what was going on. And so they implemented all these things behind the scenes, and then all of a sudden they quietly implemented it in the school, and nobody knew about it until somebody blew the whistle to a parent, and then everybody then it all blew up, and they said, "Oh,
yep.
well, it's already been doing, we've already been doing it, and the government requires it, and all that stuff," and so it became a huge big deal. They are constantly introducing things like this, and this is what the whole SEL program is going to be like here as well. They're going to use these things that are in the sex ed, the national sex ed standards material as part of the whole SEL. Mm-hmm. It sounds good. Well, we're teaching kids how to get along with each other. We're teaching them in relationships. We're teaching them these things that sound really good, but it depends on what the ideology is that underlies that.
Right.
It's one thing if you look at it and say, well, our vision for the children is to remain celibate, to remain until they're married, abstinent until they're married. Well, not every kid is going to, but that doesn't mean it's a failure. Why can't you have it as an ideal? They don't even want it as an ideal.
Or just even as a choice. I mean, they
Right.
barely. I know when my son was in high school, his friend, a girl, said, they had a speaker come in during Health and Wellness Week, and a teen mom, and the teacher said, "Okay, girls, how can we avoid you getting in the same situation?" And my son's friend raised her hand and said, "You could remain abstinent until marriage." And the teacher laughed at her.
Right.
And said, "No, we have to be realistic."
Wow.
I mean, they won't even provide it
Wow.
as a valid choice to
Right.
these kids.
Well, that's because they, like they say, well, there's no protecting their innocence. They've already engaged in this kind of activity, but that doesn't mean you can't get back on the right track.
Of course. course.
Even
of
if
course.
even if you've
started to
not
go down
fu-
one
not-
way, you can always turn around.
right, you can always turn around. And so what we do is promote the ideal. But in like I believe, as actually John Adams did too, that you can't have liberty without virtue. And I believe in churches we're supposed to be promoting virtue. Well, these sex educators are not. In fact, they have an explicitly stated standard that purity is a false value. Explicitly stated.
Who has this explicitly stated?
These people that are in the National Sex Ed Center.
Right.
7 years ago, they had a guy get up there and talk about it. He was a psychologist and said, that specifically said that purity is a false value.
That's so sick and twisted.
And so the other thing is that that one of the women at the conference, this who was national director for sex education and training for Advocates for Youth. Her idea is that children should be taught that sex is for pleasure and joy, and even no matter what age they are. It should be a pleasure-based, joy-based experience for kids.
For kids.
Yes.
So what do you say to the people who say, no, we need these national sex ed standards so that we can keep kids from being abused?
Well, that's ridiculous.
Right.
I mean, the abuse, even back in the 70s, we recognized that children needed to know something.
Good touch,
so
bad
it was,
touch.
Yeah, good. So it was good touch, bad touch, and this is who you tell.
Mm-hmm.
And so you teach them that. They don't have to know the details. They don't have to know every different kind of activity you could possibly engage in.
Right.
To be able to
We don't need to be
protect
teaching
themselves.
6th graders about anal sex and
No.
sex toys and.
No, none of that. Anybody that teaches them that should be sent to jail.
Right. They're the abusers.
And this is a grooming technique, and they say, well, no, it's been considered a grooming technique for decades to sexualize children in this way.
Mm-hmm.
And all they're doing is maybe the teacher themselves, they aren't grooming them for themselves, but they're grooming kids by proxy.
Right.
And they make them all the more vulnerable, and it characterizes, I've carried a gun my whole career, and I didn't teach my kids when they were young every detail about how to load a gun, how to unload it, how to point it, how to shoot it, all that kind of thing. I told them if they happen to come across a gun that they are not to touch it, teach it. I didn't have to teach them all the details about it.
Exactly.
And, that's the same thing that should be with, if you find a gun somewhere, come and get me. If you,
And they also use the excuse, well, these kids aren't learning it at home, so it's our responsibility. But in so many areas, the public school is often trying to put a wedge between child and parent.
Well, they've all of a sudden they've got the idea that they're the ones primarily responsible for the education of the child, but it's the Supreme Court has ruled that it's the school is supposed to teach what the parents want, not the other way around.
Right.
And the parents are the ones that have control over the kids' education and what they're to be taught, not the school.
Right.
And yet
Amen.
they have taken it on themselves to teach them secretly about all these things that parents don't want. They're doing it secretly because they know the parents don't want it taught.
Correct.
And so they know they're doing the wrong thing. And even in schools that have opted out, the problem like District 15 in this area, they have opted out of the sex education program, but they've hired a company to teach sex education that uses the national sex ed standards
Right,
as part of
right.
their program. So
Right.
you can't necessarily trust that even when they say, well, yeah, we're opting out of this, and so you're safe to send your kids to school.
Right.
Yeah.
Candor health.
Right.
Yep.
It's not necessarily the case. I mean, I don't know exactly what's being taught, and that's one of the
They're
problems
doing a
too.
1-year investigation over at District 15 based on what we brought to light over there.
Well, and so but you can't trust them to do it, because look at the way they handled the FOI requests for information on anything that the kids are dealing with. They will not send you the information. You have to go over and look
there
at,
FOIA is what
which
Tom's
is
referring to,
ridiculous.
Freedom of Information Act. They make you go in person and look at a computer or something.
So how do you do that for 800 school districts?
Right, exactly.
And so this is one of the things that is just infuriating.
Mm-hmm.
And every one of these school boards could turn that around. You know, they'll say, well, we have an exemption from actually providing you with this documentation. So if you want to look at it, you got to come in and see it. Well, if you have an exemption from providing it, then why can I look at it?
Yeah.
You know, if it's exempt, then I shouldn't be able to look at it either, right?
Good question. I mean, they just love putting up roadblocks and
Yes,
making it
that's what's going
everything
on.
they can make difficult for parents. They do.
Yep.
And so they're not being candid with the parents. They're when they started doing all that transgender bathroom stuff, they intentionally hid that from the parents.
Yep, that's why we've tried to fight that with a lawsuit. And it's just gotten worse. You know, there were we had 50 families join that lawsuit, and everybody could stay anonymous except for one. And there were people who were like, "Oh, we agree with you. We would join your lawsuit, but we don't think going to go through the trouble because this is as bad as it's gonna get. It's not, And now, how much worse have things gotten?
It's not going to do anything but get worse.
Yep. Until more people stand up and we flip these school boards and.
When you have a group of people that's promoting this material who believe that children have a right to experience sex, to have sex, to not just experience it, but they promote the idea that they should experiment with same and opposite sex relationships.
I mean, Kim Cavill is on our school board at District 211. When she ran she's up for re-election. When she ran 4 years ago, her blog was public. Sex Positive Parent was the name. I mean, she is the epitome of...
Well, and the new term of it is, what is it? I think they're sex advocates now.
Mm-hmm.
That they are advocating sex for the children.
Yep. They want to normalize it for kids.
Right. And that's part of the issue where they're trying to change pedophile into minor attracted person.
Right. Yep.
And so that to make it a neutral kind of term, because they're now saying there's more and more material that's coming out now that children aren't really harmed by having sex with an adult. It doesn't really hurt them.
So which is interesting, right? So this report came out, these findings came out, this was news this week. Chicago Public Schools Office of the Inspector General, OIG, their annual report was released this week. It showed that hundreds of Chicago teachers and school employees were accused of grooming, sexually assaulting, and raping students during the 2021-22 school year. There were a total of 470 sexual allegations last year, including inappropriate touching, grooming, sexual abuse, and illegal sexual acts such as rape and sexual electronic communication. I mean, if it's no problem, then why are there 470?
Well, yeah, and the other statistic in there is that there's only 16 in the last 4 years that have been prosecuted.
Absolutely.
So most of them are getting away with it because they do a lousy job of investigating it.
That's absolutely right.
But this is just the tip of the iceberg, though. And when the Catholic Church scandal came out in 2004, there was a report that was issued that was written by Carol Shakespeare, a professor who did this study on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education on educator sexual misconduct. She found that 9.7% of children who graduate from high school had been the victims of educator sexual misconduct sometime between kindergarten and 12th grade.
Almost 10%.
Almost 10%. So every time you watch a kid, every 10th kid that goes across the stage when they get their diploma, they've been victims of child educator sexual misconduct. Carol Shakespeare in 2004 said the problem in the schools is 100 times worse than it is in the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And this is in 2004. And so why, even today, is it minimized?
Right.
I mean, this is not a hidden problem. This is very obvious, and nobody's doing what needs to be done to correct it.
Right. So we're almost out of time. So what advice would you give to parents who either have kids in the public schools and then the parents who just parents in general? Okay, first for the parents who have kids in the public schools, what would you say?
Well, first of all, at the very least, they have to opt out of all the sex education stuff.
Yep.
So they have to say, no, my kid is not going to have any of this stuff.
Right, because even if your school opts in, every single family, of course, can opt their own child out.
Right. But I think, if I had my kids in school now, mine are long since out of school, but if I had them in school now, I would either be homeschooling them or I would be sending them to a Christian-based school that didn't go along with all this stuff.
Right.
I mean, and not all you can't trust any necessarily a private school or a Christian school.
Right, because we saw that one in Chicago.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and some of the
Project
Christian
Veritas.
schools are like some of the main denominational schools still believe in this whole LGBT agenda.
Yeah.
Right, for sure.
And so you can't necessarily trust that they're going to teach the right things. So you need to go to a conservative Christian school and check it out very carefully. But until the public schools get straightened out, I think it's lost. And if people pull their kids out of the school, then the public schools are going to have to clean up their act. Because one of the biggest problem right now is that the teachers' unions are protecting these predators that are in the school.
Mm-hmm.
They are not allowing the schools to get rid of people for normal kinds of things that they should get rid of. When I was in school, teachers were required to have sterling character. That's not the case anymore.
No.
I mean, you can have teachers right now that are teaching school during the day, and they're working at the gentleman's club at night.
Yeah. And talking about it on TikTok.
Right.
Yeah.
And look at all those teachers on TikTok that they've got in there talking about how they'll tell
talking to kindergartners about
their their sexual relationships with other people, and the parents can't do anything about it.
The good old days, we didn't know anything about our teachers' personal lives.
Well, and you shouldn't.
How they felt about any political issue or anything.
Yeah.
They should be teaching math, science, English.
Right.
And that's it, history. In real American history, not the Howard Zinn version.
Right. All right. Any parting words, Tom, as we wrap up here? We really appreciate your time. I know we could keep talking. You've had, like I said, just a fascinating career. And we really appreciate you coming in tonight.
Well, I really wish that I had better news, but it's not all that great. I think the main thing is that I think parents need to educate themselves on what to look for, how to spot a predator. I mean, I have some resources on my website that they can look up and
that's truthalliancefoundation.org.
That they can look up, and there's an article on there about securing our future. That will tell you basically how you can tell the difference between good guys and bad guys, because the good guys, or rather the bad guys, sometimes seem a lot better than the good guys.
Yeah, because they're really putting on the charm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. That's why they can be very hard to spot.
Yes. Yes.
And they prey on people who are vulnerable.
That's exactly right.
So
And
keep your kids not vulnerable.
And it's,
as much as you
I mean,
can.
one of the things that they are, kids who've gone through, like a family breakup, or they maybe were dropped by their boyfriend or their girlfriend, they get depressed, they become vulnerable to somebody to come in and exploit them sexually.
Yeah. So keep an eye on your kids and help them through the tough times and keep them close.
Right.
And check their phones.
Yeah, my kids would not have a smartphone, that's for sure.
I know predators always say they're looking for vulnerable kids, and I remember one particular predator was sharing. He said, if the kid had a father that I thought would hurt me, I'd move on to the next kid. So,
There you go.
But
All right. Thanks again, Tom, for coming
thank you,
in tonight.
Tom, so much.
Thanks for having me.
Hopefully, this is not the last time you get more information about this sex ed, because you didn't share with us. And maybe this next
We'll
time.
do a part 2. Maybe.
Yeah, part 2. How they desensitize these sex ed.
The educators.
Educators.
themselves.
Oh, yeah, I got all the information on that. I have the whole history of that, when it started and who started.
Yeah, and once you hear this, this will put the sex educators in a new light, what they actually go through and who they are. So, but
It was actually funded by the Methodist Church.
oh, wonderful.
Oh, wow. Okay. We're leaving it there, and we'll do a part 2.
Thanks,
Thanks,
very
everybody.
much. All right, have a good night. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.